September 14th, 1945. Scottsbluff, Nebraska. Lieutenant Tishi Yamamoto stood in a wheat field that stretched beyond the horizon, staring at the largest machine he had ever seen outside of combat. The metal beast gleamed in the afternoon sun, its chrome exhaust pipes reflecting light like artillery barrels. His first thought was tactical. His second was terror. Because if the Americans built war machines this size for their farms, then everything the Imperial Command had told him about enemy weakness was not just wrong, it was catastrophically, fatally wrong. Before we continue this story, I want to ask you something. If you're finding these untold accounts from the war as fascinating as I do, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. It genuinely helps this channel grow and allows me to keep bringing you these incredible forgotten moments from history. Now, let's get back to Nebraska. The air smelled of dust and diesel fuel. The machine's engine ticked as it cooled, metal contracting with sharp pings that sounded like rifle bolts. Yamamoto's hands, still calloused from weeks of cutting wheat with a hand scythe, trembled slightly. He had been trained at the Imperial Japanese Naval Academy to assess threats, to calculate angles of attack, to understand the mechanics of destruction. And this machine, whatever it was, represented a level of engineering sophistication that contradicted every intelligence briefing he had received during his service. The farmer, a man named James Peterson, stood beside the machine with his arms crossed, watching the group of 32 Japanese prisoners process what they were seeing. He had buried his son 8 months earlier. The boy had died at Guadalcanal, killed by soldiers who wore the same uniform these men wore. Yet Peterson's face showed neither hatred nor triumph, only a quiet, almost sad understanding, because he knew what was about to happen. He had seen it in the faces of every prisoner who had worked his land that summer. The moment when certainty shattered. The moment when the war finally ended, not on a battlefield, but in a wheat field in the American heartland. And in that moment, as Peterson fired up the combine harvester's engine, and the machine roared to life with a sound that made the ground vibrate beneath their feet, Yamamoto realized something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Japan had never stood a chance. Not because Americans were better warriors, but because they had been fighting an entirely different war. 3 months earlier, Yamamoto had been a different man. He had been captured on Okinawa after his destroyer was sunk by American aircraft. The rescue had been efficient, almost gentle. American medics had treated his burns with a care that confused him. He had expected execution, perhaps torture. Instead, they gave him clean bandages, morphine for the pain, and water that did not taste of metal or oil. The transport to the mainland had taken weeks. During that time, Yamamoto watched American logistics operate with a precision that seemed impossible. Supply ships arrived on schedule. Equipment functioned. Food was abundant, varied, fresh. He told himself it was temporary, a show put on for prisoners to break their morale. The propaganda films shown to Japanese soldiers before deployment had been clear. Americans were soft, dependent on luxury, incapable of sustained hardship. They would collapse under pressure. They lacked the spiritual strength that made Japanese soldiers superior despite material disadvantages. But the evidence kept accumulating. The ships were new, mass-produced, identical. The weapons were standardized, interchangeable. The soldiers were well-fed, well-equipped, almost casual in their efficiency. And most disturbing of all, they seemed to have an endless supply of everything: ammunition, fuel, clothing, medicine, things that Japanese forces had been rationing for years. When the train carried them across the American continent, Yamamoto pressed his face to the window and watched. Mile after mile of farmland, forests untouched by war, cities with lights blazing at night, visible for miles, no fear of bombing raids. Factories with smokestacks pouring production into the sky 24 hours a day. The scale of it was incomprehensible. Japan's entire industrial capacity could fit into a single American state, and there were 48 of them. Camp Scottsbluff was not what he expected. The barracks were wooden but solid, heated in winter, cooled by shade in summer. The food was adequate, sometimes better. Rice, vegetables, meat twice a week. More than he had eaten as an officer in the Imperial Navy during the final year of the war. The guards were neither cruel nor particularly friendly. They were professional, following rules that seemed to apply equally to everyone. Sergeant Robert Henderson, the American NCO who managed their work details, treated them like laborers, not enemies. He explained tasks clearly, distributed tools fairly, ensured breaks were taken. When Private Hiroshi Tanaka collapsed from heat stroke during the first week, Henderson personally carried him to the infirmary and stayed until the medic confirmed he would recover. Tanaka, a fisherman's son from Hokkaido, had never experienced such treatment from his own officers. The work itself was straightforward. Nebraska's farms needed hands. The regular workers were overseas, fighting in Europe and the Pacific. The harvest could not wait for the war to end. So the prisoners cut wheat, loaded wagons, repaired fences, dug irrigation ditches. Hard labor but purposeful. And at the end of each day, they were paid in camp scrip that could buy cigarettes, soap, writing paper from the canteen. Yamamoto had been assigned to the Peterson farm with 7 other prisoners. James Peterson was 48, broad-shouldered, with hands like leather and eyes that measured men without judgment. He had 3 sons. 2 were fighting in Europe. The third was dead. Peterson did not mention this at first. He simply showed them what needed doing and expected it done properly. The work was backbreaking. Hand scythes, wooden wagons, horses that needed care and attention. Yamamoto, who had commanded men and machines in naval combat, found himself learning to sharpen blades, stack hay, read the weather and the color of the sky at dawn. It was humbling work, but honest, and Peterson, despite his loss, despite everything, treated them with a dignity that slowly, inexorably, undermined every lesson Yamamoto had been taught about racial superiority and civilizational hierarchy. 3 weeks into the harvest, things changed. Peterson drove up to the field in his pickup truck, followed by another vehicle Yamamoto had never seen before. The machine was enormous, 20 feet long, 10 feet tall, constructed of metal panels, gears, belts, and mechanisms that seemed impossibly complex. It had huge rubber tires, a glassed-in cabin, and what appeared to be a rotating drum with blades along its front edge. The prisoners stopped working. They gathered in a loose group, staring. Corporal Kenji Sato, who had studied engineering at Tokyo University before conscription, approached cautiously, his trained eye trying to understand the machine's purpose. The size suggested military application. The construction indicated serious resources. The complexity implied advanced manufacturing capability. Peterson climbed down from his truck and walked over, the interpreter beside him. His name was George Takahashi, a second-generation Japanese-American who spoke both languages fluently. The prisoners had initially distrusted him, seeing him as a traitor to his blood. But Takahashi was patient, professional, and gradually they began asking him questions about this strange country, where ethnicity and nationality were not the same thing. "This is a combine harvester," Peterson said through Takahashi. "It cuts, threshes, and cleans wheat in a single operation. One machine does the work of 40 men in a quarter of the time." Yamamoto stared at the device. His tactical training kicked in automatically. The machine's size and apparent power suggested it was a weapon, perhaps a new type of armored vehicle designed to intimidate. The psychological impact was certainly effective, but something did not fit. The mechanism at the front, those rotating blades, they were designed for cutting plants, not armor. The collection bin on top, it was for storing grain, not ammunition. Sato was already circling the machine, examining it with scientific intensity. Peterson, seeing his interest, opened access panels and began explaining the engineering. Through Takahashi, he detailed how the gasoline engine powered multiple systems simultaneously. The header cut wheat stalks at ground level. The threshing drum separated grain from chaff using centrifugal force. Screens and airflow cleaned the grain. The whole process happened continuously as the machine moved forward at walking speed. 40 acres per day, Peterson said. One machine, one operator. This model is from 1941. It's 4 years old. We have thousands of these across the country. They've been standard equipment for decades. Sato translated for the others, his voice dropping to a whisper as the implications crystallized. 40 acres per day. One machine. He did quick calculations. A skilled worker with a scythe might manage half an acre per day under ideal conditions. This machine replaced not 40 men, but potentially 80 or more when accounting for fatigue, breaks, and human limitations. And it was 4 years old. Not a new development. Not a special wartime innovation. Not a special wartime innovation. Standard agricultural equipment, mass-produced, widely distributed, taken for granted. Yamamoto felt something fundamental shift inside him. If this was true, if these machines were indeed common civilian technology produced in such quantities that individual farmers owned them, then every assessment of American industrial capacity he had ever received was not merely optimistic, it was fantasy. The propaganda had not just exaggerated American weakness. It had inverted reality. Peterson climbed into the combine's cabin. The engine started with a roar that made the air vibrate. Black smoke puffed from the exhaust, then cleared. The mechanical symphony of gears engaging, belts spinning, drums rotating filled the field with sound. Then Peterson released the brake, and the machine began moving forward into the unharvested wheat. The prisoners watched in absolute silence. The combine advanced, cutting a swath 20 feet wide through the standing grain. Wheat stalks disappeared into the header mechanism. Seconds later, clean grain flowed from a spout into the collection bin. The chaff and straw were expelled out the back in a neat windrow. The entire process was continuous, relentless, efficient beyond anything they had imagined possible. In 15 minutes, the combine harvested what would have taken their entire group a full day to accomplish with hand tools. The machine did not tire. It did not slow. It simply processed wheat at a mechanical pace that reduced human labor to irrelevance. When Peterson finally shut down the engine and climbed out, He found the prisoners still standing motionless, processing what they had witnessed. He wiped his hands on a rag and looked at them with something like sympathy. "We've been letting you work with scythes," he said, "not because we don't have combines. We have plenty. But there aren't enough machines to harvest everything simultaneously across the whole state. You're supplementary labor, not primary labor." That night, back at the camp, Yamamoto sat in the barracks with several other officers. They spoke in low voices, careful not to be overheard by prisoners who might still cling to imperial orthodoxy. Captain Ichiro Nakamura, a former professor of political economy at Kyoto University, articulated what they were all thinking. "If the Americans can produce such machines in such quantities for agriculture," he said slowly, "then their military production capacity must be beyond anything our leadership understood. The numbers we were given, the assessments of American industrial strength, they were not just optimistic. They were deliberate lies." Yamamoto pulled out a small notebook, something the guards allowed prisoners to keep. He began writing everything he could remember about the combine harvester. Technical specifications, production dates, the casual way Peterson had discussed nationwide distribution. The fact that a 4-year-old machine was still in perfect working condition, implying not just initial production capacity, but sustained maintenance, infrastructure, and parts availability. Over the following weeks, the prisoners began noticing everything with new eyes. The trucks that supplied the camp, different manufacturers, but all functioning efficiently. The guards' wristwatches varied in style and make, implying mass production of even small consumer goods. The quality of rural roads. The electrical lines running to individual farms. The telephone systems connecting remote areas to cities. Private Tanaka, working on the Schultz farm, witnessed another revelation. Ernest Schultz, 63 years old, with 3 sons fighting in Europe, ordered spare parts for a tractor through a mail-order catalog. The parts arrived within 3 days, shipped from a warehouse 600 miles away. Tanaka understood logistics. He had seen how difficult it was to get critical supplies to Japanese forces on remote islands, even when those supplies meant the difference between survival and death. Here, civilian farmers ordered mechanical parts through the mail and received them in days. The infrastructure required for such a system, the transportation networks, the manufacturing redundancy, the inventory management, it suggested an economy operating at a level of sophistication that made Japan's industrial base look medieval by comparison. Through Takahashi, the prisoners began asking questions that would have been dangerous in the imperial military. How many factories did America have? How much steel did they produce? How many ships, planes, tanks could they build simultaneously? Takahashi answered honestly, showing them statistics from newspapers that were openly published, not classified military secrets. The numbers were staggering. In 1944 alone, the United States produced 96,000 aircraft. Japan had produced 28,000 during the entire war. American shipyards launched a new merchant vessel every single day, sometimes multiple ships. Japan's entire merchant fleet had been smaller than what America produced in a single year. But numbers alone could not convey the full reality. It was the combine harvester that made it real, because they had seen it with their own eyes, touched it with their own hands, watched it operate with mechanical inevitability. It was not propaganda. It was not exaggeration. It was simply a machine doing what it was designed to do. demonstrating through its existence that American industrial capacity was not a myth created to demoralize Japanese forces. It was the foundation of a civilization organized around different principles than anything they had been taught to understand. In November, as Nebraska winter approached, the prisoners helped with the corn harvest. This introduced them to another machine, the mechanical corn picker, which was somehow even more impressive than the wheat combine. The engineering required to strip ears of corn from standing stalks, husk them, and collect them in a single operation suggested a culture that prioritized efficiency and innovation at every level of society, not just military production. Peterson invited Yamamoto and several other prisoners to lunch one cold afternoon. His wife, Margaret, served beef sandwiches, fresh bread, vegetables from their garden, and milk. The quantity of meat alone would have been remarkable, but what struck Yamamoto was the casualness of it. This was routine, daily fare, not a special occasion. The United States produced so much food that even during a global conflict, civilians ate better than Japanese officers had during peacetime. During that lunch, Peterson told them about his son. Michael had been 19 when he died at Guadalcanal. He had been excited to serve, believed in the cause. Margaret Peterson's eyes were red, but her voice remained steady. She said she did not hate Japanese people. She hated war. She hated that young men from both nations were being consumed by decisions made by leaders far from the fighting. Yamamoto did not know how to respond. In the imperial military, such sentiments would have been considered treasonous. Yet here was a woman who had lost her son, speaking not with anger, but with grief that transcended nationality. It was profoundly unsettling, and yet it carried a truth that propaganda could never contain. By December, word of the combine harvester had spread through Camp Scottsbluff. 800 prisoners now knew that American industrial capacity was not a fabrication. Discussions in the barracks became increasingly focused on implications. Some prisoners refused to accept it, insisting it was elaborate deception. But most, especially those who had worked the farms and seen American civilian life firsthand, understood that they had been lied to by their own leaders. The winter was harsh, colder than most prisoners had known. Yet the barracks were heated, food adequate, and Americans issued winter clothing. The contrast with service in the Imperial Army was impossible to ignore. Private Tanaka later wrote, in a letter never sent during the war, that captivity felt surreal. He was better fed and housed as a prisoner than as a soldier. After Japan's surrender, news arrived. Hiroshima and Nagasaki, atomic weapons. Unconditional defeat, occupation. For many prisoners, faith in spiritual superiority collapsed overnight. For Yamamoto and others who had already seen the combine harvester, it merely confirmed what reality had begun to teach them. In March 1946, farmer Ernest Schultz spoke with Tanaka through an interpreter. Farming, Schultz said, obeyed laws ideology could not bend. You cannot harvest what you do not plant. Courage without wisdom was only waste. Had Japanese leaders understood American production, war would have been impossible. It was not honor, but mathematics. Tanaka asked why America had not demonstrated its power earlier. Some truth, Schultz replied, could only be learned through consequence. Before repatriation, Yamamoto visited the Peterson farm one last time, watching Peterson service the combine. He asked what he should tell people in Japan. Tell the truth, Peterson said. Americans were not superhuman. They built systems that worked. Tools existed to make life better, not to glorify sacrifice. Japan could do the same. They shook hands as equals. The men returned to a transformed Japan. Tanaka modernized fishing in his ruined village. Nakamura taught economics shaped by what he had seen. Yamamoto became a translator, then a businessman. Decades later, he returned to Nebraska and stood before the silent combine that had shattered his certainty. It was proof creation measured true strength.